Hi, 7th and 8th grade. Ready for some more history? I know I am. Okay, we are talking about the 1980s right now. This is right around the time your parents were born. So you can ask them all kinds of questions about the 80s and they won't remember any of it because they were just kids. So here we go. We're going to learn about what I know from the 80s and, of course, from your book. Let's talk about Walter Mondale. He ran against Reagan in 1984, but he lost. But that didn't mean that this was a non-issue. There were some important things that were going on in this election. First of all, Reagan was an incredibly popular president among the majority of Americans, and he had a really good opportunity to be reelected. Walter Mondale came across kind of surly and angry, and he was also very, very open about the fact that he was a humanist. In other words, he was more of an agnostic. He didn't really acknowledge that there even possibly was a God. He believed in humanism, that man is really the decider of his own fate. So he was really all about the human aspect rather than the religious aspect. And he kind of went against Reagan, saying that Reagan shouldn't be bringing religion into his life or the way he was living or politics. Here's the thing, though. Even though a lot of religious leaders supported Reagan, Reagan spoke of God very openly, but he was not an overtly really religious person. He was sometimes what we call a C&E Christian. He went to church like a couple times a year, Christmas and Easter. But he believed that the Bible was the guideline for his life. Mondale did not. He believed that a human being's reason was the guideline for life. Now, one of the other issues that was really important in this election is the very first time ever in history, there was a female candidate for vice president. And that woman's name was Geraldine Ferraro. And you can see on the little button there, Mondale and Ferraro. So she was the first woman ever to campaign to be vice president. She's not going to be the last, but she is going to be the first, and that needs to be recognized. Okay. In 1985, Congress passed the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, and this was designed to balance the federal budget with spending cuts over 5 years. In other words, things that didn't belong in the budget would be removed. But Congress just kept coming up with new ways to spend money. They refused to discipline their spending. And by 1986, the yearly deficit stood at $200 billion. The national debt stood at $2 trillion. And then the Congress turned around and blamed this whole mess on the president, President Reagan, even though he wasn't the one who was pushing for all of these different bills. So in this idea of this act that would balance the federal budget was pretty much unusable because Congress refused to discipline its spending. William J. Bennett, Secretary of Education under Reagan, he made some strong arguments for the return of morality and discipline to the classroom. Why? Because children weren't learning in the classrooms. That was the biggest problem. I mean, it was a huge problem. Kids were so busy acting out that they didn't have any time or no effort was being made to actually teach. We have a Christian school, but even I have this issue. I have this issue in my classrooms, and you guys know that. It's frustrating for teachers, so frustrating when we come in the beginning of the day, we know what we're going to teach, we have our stuff ready to go, and then we end up having to spend all of our time asking a student to please stop misbehaving, and then telling a student, okay, because you didn't stop when I asked you to 3 or 4 times, I need to write you demerits. I need to send you out of the classroom. It just distracts from everybody else getting a chance to learn. It is so frustrating for teachers. It's frustrating for me as a teacher to see students talking to each other when I'm trying to give them information in the classroom. And then when I ask them to stop talking, they just look at me like with death in their eyes, like they hate me because I interrupted their conversation when they shouldn't have been talking in the first place. I've had students get really angry with me because they got demerits that they deserved. And after a while, that just wears on teachers, and it gets to the point where they can't do the job anymore because it feels like we're always, always, always fighting. So with William J. Bennett, what his whole plan and idea was is that if you introduce morality into the classroom, if you teach people how to live, if you guide them, discipline again is not punishment, it is teaching them how to live by walking alongside them. If we can introduce this, you should act this way because of this reason, that if you can introduce that into the classroom, that there would be less disciplinary problems, okay? Punishments. He's right on so many levels, but honestly, the more people you have in a classroom, the more likely you are going to have distractions. The more that even if a teacher tries to teach this, if that's not being backed up in the home, that's a problem. And so he noticed that, and he tried to come up with great solutions, not just for teachers, but for parents as well. So I have all 3 of these books in my library. In fact, they're, you probably can't see them, but they're that way. I have these 3 books in my library. The first one, the blue book that I'm going to talk about, is called The Educated Child, and I've used this book multiple times as preparing to teach. This only goes through 7th and 8th grade, but I've used it to see where students technically should be, where they should be, what they should be learning in the classroom. And he just gave, a background of like, they should know these kinds of quotes. They should have an idea who this author is. They should be reading this kind of story, giving an idea of what needs to be taught at different grade levels. It's a really great resource, but it's not for teachers. Even though I'm a teacher and I used it, if you look at the book, it's a parent's guide. This is letting parents know, hey, your teacher in the classroom for your student cannot possibly teach all of this information, but your child should be doing this. So who is the second teacher for that child? The parent. The parents, your parents, were your very first teachers. They are the ones that taught you how to walk, how to talk, how to count, how to do colors. Your parents were the first ones to teach you. They continue to teach you throughout your life at home. And even after you leave home, you might be calling them with advice, because you need them to continue giving you a little information, tutoring you. Okay, the next one, The Book of Virtues and The Moral Compass. These are collections of stories that have a moral background to them. And I've read both of them. They're excellent books. And if you're looking for books of short stories, these are 2 great resources. In fact, I believe it is The Book of Virtues that is set up so that the very first story in each section, it's set up according to sections of discipline, like learning about goodness. Okay, could be one of them. And then the very first story is for like an elementary age, and then the next story is for slightly older, and the next story, and then finally you get to a story for a high school student or an adult, and then it goes to the next discipline. And it's really, really well laid out, and it's really interesting, and I enjoyed reading that book quite a lot. That was years and years ago when my youngest son was still a baby. So it's been a long time since I read that book, but I still remember it. It was a great book. So if you're looking for short stories and great resources, these are 3 fantastic resources. And if you're like me and you like to go thrift store shopping, you can usually find a copy in thrift stores, because a lot of these were published, and as people declutter over time, they get rid of some of these big bulky books, and that's a great place to look for these books. In fact, that's where I got all 3 of mine. Okay. Now, because American public education continued to decline, mostly because of disciplinary problems, the idea that kids weren't really acting the way they should in a classroom, and also because there was less teaching of fact and more teaching of social issues and ideas and what should be considered appropriate, even though that really didn't have anything to do with actual learning. Because of this education continuing to decline, some parents started enrolling their children in private Christian schools. Other parents began to practice homeschooling. Now, right now, a Harvard professor just released a report. She had a big misspelling in one of the in her report that kind of made the news as well. But a Harvard professor wrote an essay stating that homeschooling is really racist, that it is all about keeping kids as separatists and not allowing them to interact with the real world. I have also heard the same thing said about private Christian schools. So I'm gonna be blunt with you guys, because I always am, and I always give you the good and the bad. The truth is that there are certain Christian schools that were set up, especially in the South, that were set up because as a reaction to the desegregation of schools. And so schools were set up, and they were set up as religious institutions, but the practice of racial segregation is not biblical at all and should never be seen as such. So people who are putting their kids in schools and saying this is a Christian school, but we don't allow people of certain races in our school, they are telling you flat out that's not a Christian school. That's just racism. Okay? We don't have quite that issue here. Our biggest issue with race on campus tends to be student to student. It's not the teachers to the students. We welcome everyone. Our administration welcomes everyone. We have people from all over the globe at our school, and in fact from, wow, nearly every continent except for Australia and Antarctica. That is wild. I never even thought of that before, but we have kids from Asia. We have kids, and I'm talking not just second, third generations, but kids actually from Asia, children from South America, children from North America, obviously, and children from Europe. You know what? I don't think we have anybody who's, well, people who are European descent, and children from Africa. So that's pretty exciting. We have people from 5 different continents all working and living together, learning at our school. That's phenomenal. And that's the way it should be, because the Bible specifically says, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. We're all of one blood. So this nonsense of racism being presented as a Christian thought is absolutely not true. You have people who are presenting racism as a Christian philosophy because either they don't understand Christianity, or they are trying to make up for their faults. They recognize that racism is wrong, but they're still going to be racist, and they're looking for a way to defend themselves by using Christianity. Christianity and racism do not go together. They never have. And to say that they do is just a misunderstanding. And frankly, it's just a horrendous idea. Ugh. Okay. When I was in, let's see, from the time I started going to school until I finished junior high, I was going to a public school. So I have the public school background. I was one of those kids that got left behind a lot. I always passed my classes, but I didn't always comprehend what I was learning, partly because I would not pay attention in class. I had a very busy mind that was always off in la la land. So I had a hard time really focusing. I didn't have a lot of educational support at my house, and I didn't realize that that was an issue. So by the time I got into 8th grade, I really didn't have the skills I needed to be a good student. I just kind of got passed and moved up. And even though I was really, and I tell you all the time, you guys, I was kind of an idiot. When I left, we were living in another place when I was in 8th grade, and we were getting ready to go back to our hometown in Yuma, Arizona. I was living in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba when I was in 8th grade. And my parents had a decision to make. They could remain in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for another 4 to 6 years, or they could go back to our old hometown in Yuma, Arizona. This was a very big decision to make. One of the big reasons for that was because we still had a house in Yuma, and they were looking, should we sell it? Should we keep it? What should we do? And my parents did something that my parents never did. They actually asked for my opinion, and they asked which I would like to do. And I said, I kind of want to go back to my old hometown. And then they started talking to me about where did I want to go to school, because it turned out that there was a new Christian school that had just opened up in Yuma. It was in a denomination that my parents didn't belong to and that I didn't belong to. But they said, well, there's an opportunity here where you could go to a Christian school. And that was the first time I ever heard about Christian schooling. And I said, absolutely, I want to do that. And I will be really blunt with you guys. I was kind of an idiot at the time, but I knew enough that if I didn't get some kind of educational help, I would never graduate school. I was so far behind, and I knew it. So when we moved, I interviewed at the school. I was allowed in, and it was basically homeschooling with PACES, but in a classroom. And that allowed me to catch up on most of my subjects. The only subject I never caught up on was math. And I actually had to go back to college. When I went to college, I had to take some remedial classes to get up to standard on that. But again, when I went to that specific school, I grew up in a town that was very, there was people who were very racist and some people who were just like casually racist. And then people, like, I was like, ugh, I hate that stuff. And in my school, honestly, I didn't see a lot of racism, but when I did see it, it was from the students. It was from students who brought it from home. It wasn't from the teachers or from the administrators. So I didn't see that. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's something that's going to get hammered right now because of this woman doing this essay, and because unfortunately some schools are actually guilty of that. So let's talk about your Christian school. Your Christian school started in the 80s. Oh, shocker. And this was from the original yearbook, the very first year. And see how they present it. Calvary Christian School, a ministry of Calvary Bible Baptist Church. That was the original name of our church until it moved to Mountain Avenue. It used to be downtown Banning. And so you can see a program of learning with academic excellence for students of every ability built on the Word of God. And they also used a PACE program when it first started. And that is the original church building. It's so different now, isn't it? We have a porch and everything else. Back then, it was just this church and then a big old field in the back that was mostly stickers. Okay. I did not go to this school in high school, but I did know a person who did because I competed with them at the ACE competition. Okay. So getting back to politics, Reagan succeeded in cutting business taxes. Why cut business taxes? Because that's more money in the pocket of businesses for research and development and to hire more people. So it's really important. So as a result of that cutting of business tax, the result was more and better jobs were produced during the Reagan administration than any other time in the nation's history. The Reagan years were the longest period of continuous economic growth since World War II. So it works when you cut taxes. Okay, now I'm getting distracted by the Time magazine cover. Not because of Reagan, but because there's cuneiform in the corner and I'm a history nerd. So I'm like, I want to look at that. Okay, I'll have to research that later. Okay, when people have jobs and can keep most of their money rather than having to have it taxed away, they have freedom to spend that money or invest that money. And as a result, people tend to have a better quality of life. During the 80s, during the time when I was in high school, designer duds were the thing. Okay? I had friends who were very into designer labels. Me, not so much, because I was at that, that personality. It was like, I can like that stuff, but I'm not, I don't need to wear it to be popular or, anything like that. You have to remember in the 80s that the cliques were like really, really formed. You had your preppies that nobody really liked because they were so snobbish. But then some people would be very wear a lot of prep clothes and then be very nice. So again, No. Then you had New Wave. Hello. Which is a combination of influence from the punk era and the disco era. Mash those two together, you get a brand new form of music and the style that comes from that. Then you had people who, because I lived in Southwest, you had people who were full on cowboy. You had people who were more about street style, you know, the denim and the leather and all that stuff. But when it came to fashion, people had a lot of disposable income, and teenagers especially were being given higher what do you call it, allowances than ever before. In fact, you know, some of my friends had like ridiculous allowances. I didn't. My parents were really old when I was born. That's from them, not from me. I don't think they were that old. I know they weren't that old, but they, you know, they had grown up in homes where their parents had gone through the Depression. And so they were used to really pinching pennies. So my allowance went, you know, was a lot less than everybody else's allowance. But people use that allowance to go buy fancy stuff, fancy clothes, fancy jewelry. Okay, this is the stupidest thing ever, because when you're in it, you don't know how stupid it is until you grow up and you look back at it and go, wow, we were idiots. There was a thing called a swatch, which was short for Swiss watch. It was a plastic, not kidding, plastic watch. They were about $40 a pop. If you got a fancier swatch, it was anywhere from $40 to $100. But people wouldn't just get one swatch. No, because they were all about status. They were a status symbol. So people would wear multiple swatches because they looked cool. Oh, please. Okay. But this is part of, you know, the era. People had disposable income, much more disposable income. Now, under President Reagan, lower taxes and less government regulation benefited all Americans, even teenagers. Okay. Now, I didn't get the swatches, but I could go and take my allowance and go buy a blouse at the mall. You know, I could do that, or I could make a long distance phone call because that cost a whole lot of money, about $10 for an hour. Or I could go buy a book. You know, I could still purchase something with my $10 a month that I got from my parents. Okay, supply side economics is going to benefit everybody because this is how it works. You've got corporations getting tax breaks, and those tax breaks are passed on to the workers and the businesses and productions, and that means increased incomes and more spending. So the one principle of Reaganomics was to institute the economic theory of supply side economics. The theory predicted that by cutting taxes, businesses would gain more capital, hire more workers, and produce more goods. Essentially, it was trickle-down economics, where the money would trickle from capital gains to the everyday worker. And guess what? It worked. People at the time said, it's not working, it's not working. And then the next president came on and this started to fall apart. And they went, oh, it did work. Shame on us. IBM. This is International Business Machines, and they've been around since way before World War II, but they dominated the computer industry in the 1980s. International Business Machines. This is a full-on computer of the day, and this doesn't even include the tower. That thing is the tower. Okay, you notice that little black slot right there? That was where a floppy disk went. Floppy disk was exactly what it sounds like. They had two sizes. They had a big floppy disk like this, and it was just seriously floppy plastic that you stuck into your machine, and you could save all your data on that. And then later that changed to a smaller floppy disk that was encased in plastic, and that could go in your machine, and you could save everything on that. Okay, we don't even use those anymore. But it's still a part of your pop culture, because if you look on your computer and you look at the top row of icons when you're on Word or PowerPoint or anything else, or even if you are working in another program, you will see a square with like a little square, a square in the middle, and then another little square at the bottom, and that's your save button. That save button is a picture of the old-fashioned floppy disk. Okay. Microchips. Yay! These aren't tiny potato chips. No, no, no. These are tiny electronic components, which made it possible to build smaller and smaller and smaller computers. In the 70s, the computers took up an entire room, like the size of our library. Okay. And they had to be refrigerated at all times because they burned so much power. Microchips allowed computers to get so small that eventually you could hold them in your hand. Ooh. In the 1980s, handheld calculators could solve more problems than earlier computers that weighed 30 tons. 30 tons. But yep, here are calculators. Also a big status symbol. If you had a Texas Instrument calculator, you were the stuff. But if you were in elementary and you had this little professor calculator, you were even more the stuff. Oh yeah, it's the thing. Status was really important in the 80s. What can I tell you? Okay, new medical technology improved people's health. The average lifespan in 1900 was 49 years. Now let's talk about what lifespan actually is. Lifespan is when you take the entire population and you add up everybody's ages when they die, and then you basically divide that. Okay, so by how many people you had. So the average lifespan will include people who died as infants to people who died when they were 100. You're just taking that average. So the average lifespan in 1900 was 49 years. And primarily that was because of disease. Okay, not diet, as we were later told, but it was mostly because of disease. By the 1990s, it was 73 years. And when you think about how disease is going to be discovered and treated, a lot of that was because of new medical technology. Heart disease could be treated better because of medical technology. Things like meningitis, being able to, or tuberculosis, being able to even diagnose those diseases were important, were diagnosed better because of medical technology. We had better x-rays, we had better testing, we had all of this new stuff that we could use to find out what actually was wrong with the human body and then treat it appropriately. Computer-guided scanners, this is like what I'm talking about here. They permitted physicians to view the inside of the human body and diagnose medical problems without exploratory surgery. Yep, there was a time in history where you went in and you were really sick and they couldn't figure out from the outside what was wrong with you. They didn't have a CAT scan or an MRI. They actually had to put you under and open you up and do an exploratory surgery to find out what was wrong with you. And if it was something that could be taken care of with medication, they'd just sew you up and give you the meds. But that's an invasive procedure to find out what in the world's wrong. So MRIs, magnetic resonant imaging, and CAT scans are both used now to see the inside of a person. Great advances were also made in the area of organ transplants. This is body parts taken from donors and even from corpses. It can happen. I know somebody who had this done, actually. So the idea that you could take a heart out of a person who was healthy but died of an accident, you could remove their heart, put it on ice, fly it to another hospital, open up somebody who had a defective heart, someone who was dying because their heart was not working properly. You could remove the bad heart, dispose of it, and put the other person's good heart inside that body. That was just a mind-blowing, great advance in medicine. They also discovered something that the Greeks actually knew. It was that the liver can reproduce itself. So when someone goes through a liver transplant, they don't need a dead donor. They can actually have a living donor. So for instance, if Mr. S found out he needed a new liver and I was a match, I could go to the hospital with him and they would take a piece of my liver out and put it in him and it would grow to a full-size liver. Crazy, huh? Now, why did the Greeks know that before us? I don't know, but they did, because they have a mythological story of Prometheus, who every day his liver is eaten by an eagle because he's being punished by Zeus. And every night it grows back and the eagle comes back and eats it the next day. So they knew something we didn't know for a very long time. Okay, let's talk about bionic medicine. Before the 80s, this was science fiction. So much so that it made it into the pop culture realm. We had the Bionic Woman, and the predecessor to that was a $6 million man. These TV shows followed two people. One, I don't remember what the $6 million man, what happened to him, because I didn't watch that one. I didn't like that one so much. But the Bionic Woman, she was in a parachute accident. She was doing skydiving and her chute didn't open. And so she crashed and a lot of her stuff got crushed. And so they replaced her crushed body parts with bionic limbs. And so she became stronger and faster, and she could run really fast. She could hear really well. Bionic Man, I think, had a funky eye that he could see stuff. Okay. But bionic medicine ended up going out of science fiction on TV shows in the 70s into real life in the 80s. So this is the science of man-made organ and limb replacement, such things as heart pacemakers that actually control the electrical beat of the heart, and miniature implants to stimulate hearing, touch, and vision. So cool. And see, I love this part of history when people are given the opportunity to show us what they can do to help benefit mankind. So I love this part of history. My least favorite part of history, teaching war. This is my favorite part. Okay, but we have to stop now. It's been over 30 minutes and I need to let you go so you can do all the other stuff that you need to do today. So you have a really good day, and I will get back with you again tomorrow for another part of this lecture. Bye.